Welcome to Unpolished but Called. I'm Kathrin Shaffer. There's this quiet tension we don't always talk about, where we say we trust God, we believe He's working, we know He's faithful. And yet, when we look at our actual everyday life, it doesn't always feel like anything is moving in a way we can point to. We're not questioning God in a crisis of faith kind of way. It's more subtle than that. It's that low-level wondering that sits in the background while we're going about our day, where we're doing what we know to do, trying to follow Jesus in real life, and still thinking, okay, but what exactly is happening right now? Because most of the time, it doesn't look like much. It looks like getting up, handling responsibilities, managing conversations, trying not to say the things that pop into our head too quickly, remembering halfway through the day that we meant to pray about something and then circling back to it later. It looks like ordinary life, not some clearly marked spiritual progression where we can track exactly how God is moving and what He's doing next. And that's where things get a little uncomfortable, because we expect following Jesus to feel more directional than this. Not easier or perfect, but at least a little more visible, something we could recognize in real time. Instead, there are long stretches where everything feels steady but unclear. Nothing is falling apart, but nothing is obviously shifting either. And without realizing it, we start using what we can see as the measuring stick for what God must be doing. If our circumstances look the same, if the questions we've been carrying are still there, if the things we've been praying about haven't resolved yet, it's very easy to assume that nothing much is happening. And that assumption feels reasonable. It's also usually wrong, because a lot of what God is doing doesn't unfold in front of us. It unfolds beyond us, outside the small portion of life we can actually observe while we're in it. It's not always tied to the moment we're standing in, and it doesn't always involve us in a way we can track, which means there can be real movement taking place while everything in our immediate view looks unchanged. And that disconnect is where faith stops being theoretical and starts becoming something we actually have to live. Following Jesus has a way of exposing how much we rely on visibility to feel secure. Because even when we say we trust God, what we're often looking for is some form of confirmation that we're not just drifting. We want to know that what we're doing matters, that the choices we're making are leading somewhere, that the prayers we're praying are connecting to something real. And when we don't see a clear response or a noticeable shift, it's very easy to start interpreting that silence as inactivity. But the way God works rarely fits inside our need for immediate confirmation. While we're focused on what's right in front of us, our routines, responsibilities, conversations we're having, the situations we're trying to navigate, God is already working in places we're not present for. He's not limited to what we can observe. He's not confined to the small window of what we understand in the moment. His work extends beyond our awareness into timing we don't control and circumstances that haven't reached us yet. That means things can be unfolding in a meaningful way without us having any direct evidence of it. And that's the part we struggle with. Because from our perspective, life looks unchanged. The same situations show up, the types of conversations happen, The same questions we brought to God last week are still sitting there this week. We're trying to follow Jesus faithfully in the middle of all of that. But without something clearly shifting, it can feel like we're just maintaining rather than moving. But Jesus never framed faith as something that would always feel measurable in the moment. He spoke about seeds, about things growing beneath the surface before anything appears above it, about work that happens in ways that are not immediately visible. And if we take that seriously, it changes how we interpret these kinds of seasons. Because instead of assuming nothing is happening, it becomes possible to consider that something is developing in a place we don't yet have access to. That development doesn't always involve us directly. Sometimes it's happening in the timing of things we haven't stepped into yet. It's happening in the decisions of other people, in conversations we're not part of, circumstances that are being shaped long before they intersect with our life. We don't see that process. We don't hear those conversations. We don't know how those pieces are coming together. So, from where we're standing, it feels like we're waiting. But what if we're not actually waiting in the way we think? What if what feels like stillness from our perspective is actually movement that just hasn't reached us yet? That's a different way of looking at it, and it requires a different kind of trust. Because now the question isn't, can we see God working? It's, can we trust that God is working even when we can't see how? And that kind of trust doesn't come naturally. It develops over time, usually through experience, when we start noticing how often things only make sense in hindsight. A situation that felt frustrating later reveals a purpose we didn't see at the time. A delay that didn't feel good ends up protecting us from something we would have walked into too early. A door that didn't open eventually makes sense when something more fitting appears later. While we were in those moments, none of that was clear. There was no indication that God was doing something intentional. It just felt like life unfolding without explanation. But when we look back, we can start to see that Jesus was not absent in those moments. He was present in ways that didn't require our awareness to be effective. He was working in timing, in circumstances, in ways that extended beyond what we could observe in real time. And that realization shifts something. Because it means the absence of clarity doesn't equal the absence of God. It means that just because we can't trace what he's doing right now doesn't mean he's not doing anything. It means our perspective, while real, is also limited. And once that starts to settle in, it changes how we move through the days that don't make sense yet. Not perfectly, not with full understanding, but with enough awareness to recognize that what feels like nothing might actually be something we just don't see yet. There's also something else that quietly gets exposed in these seasons, and it's how much we associate God's activity with things we can immediately connect back to ourselves. When something lines up clearly, when a prayer is answered in a way we can recognize, when a situation shifts and we can say, that must have been God. It's easier to feel anchored. There's a sense of confirmation in that. It reassures us that we're not imagining things, that we're not just hoping for something that isn't there. But when that kind of clarity isn't present, it reveals how uncomfortable we are with not being able to trace His work directly. Because if we can't trace it, we start questioning it. Not always out loud, in a way that sounds like doubt to anyone else. But internally, it starts to show up in how we think. We start trying to fill in the silence with explanations that make sense to us. Maybe we need to do more. We miss something. Maybe we're not hearing Him clearly. Maybe we're further behind than we thought. And before long, we've turned a lack of visibility to a conclusion about what God is or isn't doing. That's a heavy thing to carry, especially when it's based on incomplete information. Because the truth is, we're not in a position to evaluate everything God is doing in real time. We don't have access to the full picture. We don't see how one moment connects to another until later. And even then, it's only partial. There are layers to what He's doing that we won't fully understand while we're still in the middle of it. That doesn't mean we're disconnected from Him. It means we're dependent on Him in a way that doesn't rely on constant explanation. And that's a different kind of relationship than the one we tend to default to. We often approach faith as something that should come with clarity attached. Like if we're doing this right, we'll have a steady sense of direction and understanding. But walking with Jesus doesn't always feel like that. There are stretches where the clarity is limited. The next step is all we have, and where the bigger picture remains out of reach. That doesn't mean we're off track. It means we're in a place where trust is being stretched beyond what we can verify. And while that doesn't feel comfortable, it is where something deeper starts to take shape. Not something dramatic or immediate, but something steady, a kind of confidence that isn't built on what we can currently see, but on who God has already proven Himself to be. That kind of confidence doesn't remove the questions. It just keeps them from taking over. Because instead of needing everything to make sense right now, there's a growing awareness that understanding often comes later. And that not having it yet doesn't mean something is wrong. It just means the story isn't finished at this point. And when we start to look at it that way, the pressure to interpret every moment correctly begins to ease a little. Not completely, but enough to create space for us to keep moving forward without constantly trying to decode everything around us. Which, if we're being honest, is probably a healthier place to be than the one where we're overanalyzing every detail, trying to figure out what God is doing behind the scenes. Because most of that work isn't meant to be analyzed while it's happening. It's meant to be walked through. And this is usually where things start to shift in a way we can finally recognize. Not because everything suddenly becomes clear all at once, but because something that was developing outside our awareness finally reaches us. The conversation opens a door we didn't see coming. A situation resolves in a way that didn't seem possible a few weeks ago. A connection forms that feels almost too well timed to be random. And our first instinct is to treat that moment as the beginning, because that's when we experienced it. But it wasn't the beginning. It's just the point where it became visible to us. That distinction matters more than we think, because it quietly corrects the story we've been telling ourselves about the season we just came out of. What we labeled as nothing happening wasn't empty, it was simply incomplete. There were pieces already in motion that hadn't reached us yet. And the moment we're standing in now is the result of those pieces finally intersecting with our life in a way we can see. That doesn't mean everything suddenly makes perfect sense. It usually doesn't. There are still gaps. There are still parts we can't fully explain. But there's enough there to recognize that God was not absent in the stretch that felt unclear. Jesus was present in ways that didn't require our awareness, working in timing and circumstances that were never dependent on us, understanding them in real time. And that realization tends to settle something internally, not by removing every question, but by shifting how we interpret the ones that remain. Because once we've seen that pattern, even a few times, it becomes harder to believe that a lack of clarity means a lack of movement. It becomes easier to hold space for the possibility that something is unfolding, even when we don't have access to it yet. The situation in front of us may still look unchanged, but our interpretation of it starts to loosen a bit. Instead of assuming we're stuck, there's a little more room to consider that we might simply be early in the process. And that changes how we carry those seasons. There's less urgency to force an answer out of something that hasn't fully formed yet. Less pressure to decode every detail in order to feel secure. Less tendency to jump to conclusions about what God is or isn't doing based solely on what we can currently observe. That doesn't mean we suddenly become perfectly patient people, because let's be honest, that's not happening overnight. But there is a subtle shift in how tightly we grip the need to understand everything right now. And that matters, because when we loosen that grip, even slightly, it creates space for us to stay present in what's actually in front of us instead of constantly trying to reach ahead into what we don't have yet. It allows us to follow Jesus in the day we're currently living, not the one we're trying to predict or control. That's a quieter kind of faith. It doesn't feel impressive. It doesn't come with a constant sense of clarity or direction, but it is steady. And over time, that steadiness becomes more grounding than the kind of certainty we were originally looking for. Another thing that becomes clearer in hindsight is how often God's work involved details we never would have thought to manage ourselves. The timing of something lining up just right, the way a conversation goes in a direction we didn't plan, the way a situation resolves without us forcing it, those are the kinds of things that don't draw attention to themselves in the moment. But later on, they stand out as reminders that not everything depended on our effort or awareness. And that's both humbling and relieving, because it means we were never carrying the full weight of making everything happen in the first place. Our role was never to orchestrate the entire outcome. It was to stay faithful in what we were given while God handled the parts we couldn't reach. And that includes the parts we didn't even know existed yet. So, when a season feels quiet or unclear, or like it's lacking direction. It doesn't automatically mean something is off. It may simply mean that the visible portion of the story hasn't caught up to what God is already doing behind the scenes. It may mean we're in the middle of something that hasn't fully come together yet. And that's not the same thing as being stuck. There's something steady about realizing that our ability to see what God is doing has never been the thing that determines whether He's working or not. It's just the thing we tend to rely on the most. And when that starts to loosen a bit, even just enough to recognize that we don't have the full picture, it changes how we walk through the parts of life that don't make sense yet. Not because everything suddenly becomes clear, but because we stop assuming that clarity is the only sign that God is present. What we're doing here in these conversations is learning how to live that out in real time, not in a polished, everything tied together way, but in the middle of real life where things are still unfolding, where we're following Jesus without always knowing how the next part connects, where we're learning to trust Him, not just in the moments we understand, but in the moments we don't. If this has been helpful for you, if these conversations have been grounding in any way, there are a few simple ways you can support the podcast. Sharing it with someone who would resonate with it would make it it makes a big difference than you think. Leaving a review helps. Reaching out, even on Facebook. Leave me a message. You can reach me at Kathrin Shaffer on Facebook. Drop me a line. I'm reachable on there. I'm most active on Facebook. If you're looking for something else, a little bit more real, not just surface level encouragement, everything is in the show notes. Everything that's connected to the podcast, the website, what we're building here, including a free 5-day Start Here guide, including other resources. Otherwise, thank you for sitting in this conversation with me, and we will be back after the weekend. We'll talk again soon. Thank you.